Welcome back to the new adventures of the monad. Let us take a break now from our look at the successive sub-races of the Atlantean root race. We turn our attention now to the civilization that was developed during this root race, especially the Toltec, the third sub-race, which represented the zenith of the whole root race. It would not be a wild assumption that the history of the Atlantean race, as of the Aryan race, was interspersed with periods of progress and decay. Eras of culture were followed by times of lawlessness during which all scientific and artistic development was lost. These periods again being succeeded by civilizations reaching still higher levels. Think of our history of the Bronze Age collapse in 1200 BCE, or the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the return to petty kingdoms. The following description therefore applies to the periods of culture, and whilst not exclusively applicable to one subrace, it may be taken to apply principally, as already mentioned, to the great Toltec civilization, the chief of all the Atlantean civilizations. The government was autocratic, and under the divine kings, no system could have been better suited for the populace. Democracy in many instances is overrated. It was planned by the wise for the benefit of all and not by special classes for their own advantage. Hence the general comfort was immensely higher than in modern civilizations. Governors were held accountable for the welfare and happiness of their provinces, and crime or famine was regarded as due to their negligence or incapacity. Rulers were drawn chiefly from the upper classes, but aptitude rather than class was the necessary qualification. Sex was no disqualification for any office in the state. Music was practiced, but it was crude, and the instruments were primitive. Although a yak herder on the Tibetan plateau may resonate with the sounds they produced. All the Atlanteans were fond of color, both the inside and the outside of their houses being brilliantly decorated. The art of painting, however, was never well established, though there was some kind of drawing and painting. Sculpture was widely practiced and reached a high degree of aesthetic beauty. It is interesting that if you look at our recognized ancient culture, it was sculpture again which predominates in our estimation of their achievements. It became customary for every person who could afford it to place in one of the temples an image of themselves. These were carved in wood or hard black stone like basalt, or even in auriculum, a metal mentioned by Plato to have been found in Atlantis. There was, of course, gold and silver as well. The result was a fair resemblance of the individual, sometimes a striking likeness. Architecture was the art most widely practiced, the buildings being massive and of gigantic proportions. Houses were built detached, even in cities encompassing up to 4 blocks sometimes, surrounded by a central courtyard in the middle of which was a fountain. A characteristic feature of the Toltec house was the tower that rose from one of the corners or the center of one of the blocks. An outside spiral staircase led to the upper stories, and a pointed dome terminated the tower, this often being used as an observatory. Some houses were ornamented with carvings, frescoes, or painted patterns. The windows were provided with a material similar to glass, but less transparent. Maybe it was alabaster. The interiors were furnished, but not in elaborate detail. Nevertheless, the life was heavily civilized of its kind. The temples were huge halls, even more stupendous than those of Egypt. The pillars supporting the roof were square, or occasionally round. In the days of the decadence of the Toltec, the aisles were surrounded by innumerable chapels containing statues of the most important inhabitants, ceremonial worship of the images being carried out by the priests engaged for the purpose. The temples also had their towers and domes. These were used for sun worship and as observatories. The interiors of the temples were inlaid or even plated with gold and other precious metals, these metals being obtained by transmutation, this being a private industrial enterprise by which the alchemists earned their living. Gold, being more admired than silver, was produced in much greater quantity. Gold, silver, and auriculum were the metals most used for decoration and domestic utensils. Armor was inlaid with these metals, being used merely for show in pageants and ceremonies. Gold helmets, breastplates, and greaves over the shins were worn on such occasions, over tunics and stockings of brilliant colors, scarlet, orange, and a very exquisite purple. Buying and selling took place privately except when large public fairs were held in open spaces in the cities. It would seem that we have not advanced our style of living until very recent times. Up to about 800,000 years ago, Toltec was the universal language, though remains of the Romuald and Slavati speeches survived in remote districts. All the languages were agglutinative, Chinese today being the nearest analog. All through the ages, the Toltec language remained fairly pure and survived with slight alterations for thousands of years. It was still present in Mexico and Peru, though modified in pre-Columbian times. All schools were endowed by the state, and primary education was compulsory. But reading and writing were not considered necessary for workers in the fields or handicrafts. Children with aptitude were drafted into the higher schools at the age of 12, where they were taught, as was most appropriate to each child, agriculture, mechanics, hunting and fishing, etc. The properties of plants and their healing qualities formed an important branch of study. There were no recognized physicians, but each person knew something about medicine as well as magnetic healing. Chemistry, mathematics and astronomy also were taught, the object being the development of the students' psychic faculties and instruction in the more hidden forces of nature. In this category were included the occult properties of plants, metals and precious stones, as well as alchemical transmutation. As time went on, they were principally occupied in developing the personal power which Buller-Lytton called vril, and the operation of which he fairly accurately described in The Coming Race. As decadence set in, the dominant classes monopolized for themselves the educational facilities and natural aptitude was disregarded. Having no sense of the abstract, the Atlanteans were unable to generalize, for example. They had no multiplication tables. Arithmetic was to them a system of magic, a child having to learn elaborate rules without ever knowing the reason for them. Thus, 4 sets of rules for mathematical magic had to be memorized for every combination of numbers from 1 to 10, with regard to addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Most of their calculations, however, were made by an abacus or framework, something that is now used by the Chinese and Japanese. The Atlanteans were clever at amassing facts and had prodigious memories. The habitual use of clairvoyance enabled them to observe the processes of nature, now invisible to most, so that science was carried far, its applications of arts and crafts being also numerous and useful. They had knowledge of forces which today have been lost. One of these forces was employed to propel both air and water ships, another for changing the attractive force of gravity into a repelling force, so that the raising of gigantic stones to a lofty height was a regular occurrence. The subtler of these forces was not applied to machinery, but was controlled by the willpower, using the thoroughly understood and developed mechanism of the human mind and body. Agriculture received a good deal of attention, experiments being carried out in the crossing of both animals and plants. Wheat, for example, was crossed with the indigenous grasses and produced oats and other cereals. Less satisfactory were the attempts which produced wasps from bees and white ants, in brackets termites, from ants. From an elongated melon with scarcely any pulp and full of seeds, they produced the plantain or banana. As a card-carrying agronomist, what has just been recounted would cause consternation. Today, we can trace the origins of varieties of food we now eat. But we have set ourselves a narrative that it all started less than 12,000 years ago. Why? Because in the records we see settlements that seem to be pre-agricultural, and when we date them, usually through the pottery they used, we conclude that the agricultural revolution got underway about 9,000 years ago. What, however, if this was not the result of people discovering agriculture, but them rediscovering it? Something to ponder. Consider the horse. It evolved in North America, yet it was reintroduced to the indigenous population by the conquistadors. Among domesticated animals, they had creatures like very small tapir, which fed on roots or herbage, or on whatever came their way, like the modern pig. They also had large cat-like animals and wolf-like ancestors of the dog. Their carts were drawn by creatures somewhat like camels. Peruvian llamas would probably be descendants from these. The ancestors of the Irish elk roamed about the hills, semi-wild, but still under the control of the humans. Artificial heat and colored lights were used in the crossing and interbreeding of different kinds of animals to speed up the processes of recombination. They worked especially with amphibians and reptilian forms which had run their evolutionary course and were ready to assume the more advanced type of birds and mammals, acting in cooperation with the Manu, from whom all improvements in type, domestic animals like the horse were produced. But when war and discord set in towards the end of the Golden Age, humanity began to prey on each other, and the animals left to themselves followed our example and also began to prey on one another. Some were trained by humans to hunt, and thus, from the semi-domestic cat descended the leopard and jaguar. It seems that the lion would have been a more gentle and powerful servant for the processes of traction had humanity fulfilled the task entrusted to them by the Manu. In fact, if humanity had done all their duty, it was quite conceivable that we might have had no carnivorous mammals. Remember, we are talking about a domestication process that lasted for millions of years. Something that modern science could not conceive of. So, on that sobering thought, let's leave it there for today and look at the city of the Golden Gate in more detail next time. Thank you.